Millionaire marries mistress after leaving pregnant wife, but learns a painful lesson. Daniel Harrington was the kind of man who seemed to have everything: millions in the bank, a flourishing tech empire, and a beautiful wife carrying his child. But beneath the glossy surface lay an explosive secret that threatened to shatter his world. When Daniel's pregnant wife, Rachel, discovered he had been seeing another woman, the news spread like wildfire through the upper echelons of Dallas society. In the blink of an eye, Daniel made the fateful choice to leave his wife and marry his mistress, Julia Monroe. Little did he know that his dream of chasing unbridled passion would spiral into a torrent of heartbreak, betrayal, and unforeseen tragedy. From the outside looking in, Daniel Harrington led a charmed life. At 35, he was the CEO of Harrington Innovations, a tech company poised to become the next major disruptor in Silicon Valley, despite being headquartered in Dallas, Texas. He had never allowed geographical norms to restrict his ambition. His parents, Martin and Sandra Harrington, had raised him to believe that nothing was impossible if you worked hard and took bold risks. And in many ways, he lived by that motto. Standing 6 feet tall with impeccably styled dark hair, Daniel carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew he could walk into any room and become its center of gravity. Whether he was addressing a board meeting filled with venture capitalists or negotiating new deals with potential partners, his presence never went unnoticed. Charisma was the word people often used. Though fearless might have been more apartments, but Daniel's success wasn't just about money. He had a reputation for being forward-thinking, philanthropic, and genuinely kind. He often donated to homeless shelters and education funds, with a special emphasis on STEM programs for underprivileged youth. Publicly, he was lauded as a man of substance, a figure who redefined what it meant to be a modern businessman in a world of fast-paced, high-stakes technology. It also helped that Daniel's personal life seemed to mirror his professional success. His wife, Rachel Harrington, was the picture of elegance and warmth. Rachel came from a modest background, but had studied her way into a prestigious law school. After graduating, she launched her career in corporate law, working for a Dallas-based firm known for its charitable contributions and ethical stances. Some said Rachel balanced Daniel in every way. Her stability, moral compass, and gentle nature often tempered his impulsiveness and ambition. Together, Daniel and Rachel appeared unstoppable. Their combined influence made them the it couple, the type who graced the covers of business magazines, walked hand in hand into galas, and hosted lavish charity dinners at their sprawling estate in Highland Park. When Rachel became pregnant, the media glow intensified. Paparazzi snapped pictures of the radiant mother to be always poised with a soft smile, while Daniel's protective arm cradled her gently. Friends and family alike anticipated that this child would be blessed in every possible way, surrounded by wealth, love, and promise. Yet behind the glossy facade, Daniel felt a restlessness he couldn't entirely explain. Life with Rachel, for all its outward perfection, had begun to feel too predictable. He believed that his business success thrived on novelty, on adrenaline-pumping decisions. And over time, his marriage started to reflect none of that rush. He had grown accustomed to the day-to-day routine: early morning coffee with Rachel, a carefully scheduled day of meetings, investment summits, and by evening, a quiet dinner with discussions about nursery furniture and baby names. Privately, Daniel wondered if settling down too soon had stifled him somehow. The spark that once made him rush home to Rachel was waning. Rachel sensed it too. His eyes no longer lit up as they once did when they talked about the future. She chalked it up to the pressures of his rapidly expanding business, and a new pregnancy stress could manifest in different ways, she reasoned. In moments of clarity, Daniel chastised himself for feeling this way. He had a beautiful wife, a child on the way, and a thriving career. What more could he want? But the truth was, he yearned for an excitement that wasn't there anymore. And though he'd never dare admit it to Rachel, he suspected he might look for it elsewhere if he couldn't find it within the life he already had. By all external measures, Daniel's life was perfect. But deep down, the seeds of discontent were already planted, and they were slowly, imperceptibly beginning to bloom. The first time Daniel laid eyes on Julia Monroe, it was in the glossy boardroom of Harrington Innovations. She had been recommended by none other than Michael Parker, a prominent venture capitalist known to be Daniel's mentor and longtime friend. Michael swore by Julia's expertise in brand management and digital marketing, insisting that hiring her firm could catapult Harrington Innovations to the next level. Julia stood out immediately. While the room was filled with men and women in crisp business suits, she exuded a kind of casual elegance that resisted the corporate mold. Tall, with auburn hair and piercing green eyes, she spoke with a confidence that both disarmed and intrigued Daniel. Her slender figure and well-tailored attire weren't lost on him, nor was the subtle perfume she wore that seemed to linger in the air. But it wasn't just Julia's appearance that captivated him, it was her intelligence and the way she spoke about brand strategy as though it were an art form. She laid out a roadmap for Harrington Innovations that revolved around authenticity and emotional resonance concepts that often felt tangential in the tech world. As she shared her vision, Daniel found himself leaning forward, absorbing every word, feeling the same thrill he experienced when discovering a groundbreaking software solution. Julia's ideas were innovative, and she radiated a drive that matched his own. After the meeting, Daniel approached Julia with the intention of making small talk. "Julia, your presentation was incredible," he said, attempting to sound casually appreciative. She smiled, her eyes flickering with something that could be called interest. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Your company has so much potential. I'd be honored to help expand your reach. Please, call me Daniel," he replied, gesturing for her to walk with him down the corridor. "I'm impressed by your insights. Maybe we can schedule a follow-up discussion, just the two of us, to refine the strategy." Julia nodded. "Of course, Daniel. My schedule is flexible, especially for a project like this. Let's set something up soon." That was all it took. A spark had been lit, the kind of spark Daniel hadn't felt in a long while. After she left, Daniel stood in the corridor, staring at the empty space where Julia had been, a surge of adrenaline pulsating through him. Part of him felt guilty, recalling Rachel at home, possibly putting together nursery decor, but another part, the larger, more persuasive part, felt awakened. In the coming weeks, Daniel and Julia dove deeper into collaboration. They communicated constantly through emails, phone calls, and text messages. Business lunches stretched into late afternoon brainstorming sessions. Julia's marketing savvy was undeniable, but there was another layer to their interaction, a flirtatious undercurrent that was difficult to ignore. They laughed at each other's jokes a little too earnestly. Their smiles lingered just a second longer than they should. One night, after an especially long meeting, Daniel and Julia found themselves in the dimly lit lounge of a high-end hotel near the Harrington Innovations office. Their official reason for being there was to debrief on the day's progress, but soon business talk evaporated into personal revelations. Julia confided that she'd moved from Los Angeles to Dallas after a failed relationship and was determined to rebuild her life and career. Daniel revealed more about his childhood than he usually did, sharing stories of how his father Martin had taught him to always push boundaries. The conversation felt intimate, almost charged with electricity. By the time they realized how late it was, the lounge was nearly empty. They walked out together, heads close in whispered conversation until they reached Julia's car in the parking lot. The moon illuminated the space between them, and in that moment, Daniel could feel the boundaries of his marriage blurring. Julia looked up at him with those enigmatic green eyes, and for a second he felt compelled to kiss her. A mixture of desire and guilt battled inside him. He pulled back at the last second, muttering, We should probably call it a night." Julia's lips parted slightly, and she seemed on the verge of saying something, but she simply nodded. "Yeah, you're right. Another long day tomorrow." They lingered there for a heartbeat, tension thick in the cool night air. Eventually, Daniel stepped back, letting the moment pass. He drove home with his mind swirling in confusion, torn between the thrill of a new connection and the responsibilities that awaited him under the roof he shared with Rachel. At home, Rachel was asleep on the sofa, a baby book spread across her lap. Daniel paused to watch her gentle, steady breathing, feeling a pang of guilt. He couldn't help wondering why he didn't feel the same rush of excitement when he looked at his pregnant wife. That night, he lay awake, realizing that a line had already been crossed in his heart, whether he had acted on it physically or not. Julia Monroe was no longer just a business associate. She was a temptation, a possibility, and his life was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. No single event marked the transition from harmless flirtation to a full-blown affair. It happened gradually, an accumulation of near misses, prolonged eye contact, and accidental touches that neither Daniel nor Julia bothered to resist. They kept their relationship under the radar by necessity. Harrington Innovations was a place where rumors spread quickly, and Daniel's marriage to Rachel was well known. The closer they became, the more elaborate their secrets grew. They met after work under the guise of client dinners. On days when their schedules aligned, they'd steal a moment in Daniel's office, the door locked behind them for a hasty kiss or whispered exchange of longing. Julia proved adept at navigating these hush-hush rendezvous. Her instincts for discretion matched her business acumen, and soon they had crafted an unspoken rulebook for their covert relationship. Each day, Daniel found himself wanting more. The thrill of deception, the adrenaline rush of sneaking away to be with Julia, and the novelty of discovering her world drew him in like a magnet. They talked about everything except Rachel and the pregnancy, an unspoken boundary they seemed to share. Perhaps it was Daniel's way of compartmentalizing his life, or maybe Julia's way of pretending he wasn't taken. But guilt remained. At home, Rachel grew heavier with child each passing week, her excitement overshadowed by Daniel's distracted demeanor. She did her best to involve him in everything: doctor's visits, baby name discussions, and nursery shopping trips. He often came along, physically present but mentally distant. Rachel could sense something was off. Sometimes she'd catch him staring at his phone with a small smile. When confronted, Daniel would claim it was work, though Rachel suspected otherwise. One afternoon, after a routine checkup, Rachel tried to initiate a conversation in the car ride home. "Daniel, is everything all right? You've been so distant lately. I'm worried about you, about us." He forced a smile, reaching for her hand. "I'm fine, Rack. Just a lot on my plate at the office. The company is expanding so quickly, I barely have time to breathe." Rachel squeezed his hand. "I understand, but please remember I'm here. We're supposed to be in this together." Daniel nodded, silently vowing to at least try to be more emotionally available. But that same evening, he found himself at Julia's apartment, an upscale unit in a newly developed high-rise with a view of the Dallas skyline. She greeted him at the door with a glass of wine and a mischievous grin. He sank into her world easily, letting the tension in his body melt away in her presence. Lying in her bed, with the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Daniel felt invincible. He whispered sweet nothings to her, promises he knew might never be fulfilled. Julia listened, a slight smirk playing at her lips, as though she relished the impossibility of their situation. One night, after they had shared an especially passionate encounter, Daniel found himself blurting out words he never thought he'd say to another woman. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he confessed, his heart pounding. Julia's eyes widened, reflecting a blend of pleasure and wariness. "Daniel," she whispered, brushing a hand across his cheek, "this is complicated. You know that, right?" He closed his eyes briefly, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume. "I know," he replied, "but I don't think I can stop." Julia looked at him thoughtfully, then pressed a gentle kiss on his forehead. "Neither can I," she said. In the quiet moments that followed, the enormity of what he was doing began to sink in. He was lying to Rachel, his wife, who was carrying his child and risking everything he'd worked so hard to build. Yet in that moment, the guilt didn't outweigh the ecstasy he felt in Julia's arms. The dangerous, heady excitement of their affair had become an addiction, one that threatened to devour them both. Back at home, signs of trouble had become harder to hide. Late-night text messages, weekend business trips that never seemed to produce any tangible outcomes. Even Daniel's personal assistant, Fiona McNeil, began to look at him strangely, as though she suspected something. Friends like Anthony Green, another local entrepreneur, made oblique comments about how marriage can be tough sometimes, especially when facing the pressures of success. But Daniel dismissed the warning signs, convinced he could handle the delicate balancing act. After all, he was Daniel Harrington, master strategist, risk-taker, and visionary. He believed he could control the narrative just as he controlled everything else. He had no idea that the first real crack in his life's foundation was on the horizon, and it would split open everything he thought he knew about himself and his future. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when everything came to a head. Rachel had decided to surprise Daniel at the office with lunch, a gesture she hoped might rekindle some closeness between them. She had just finished a checkup, and her doctor had given her reassuring news about the baby's health. Carrying a paper bag filled with Daniel's favorite Mediterranean wraps, she made her way through the sleek corridors of Harrington Innovations. Most employees greeted her warmly. Rachel had long been a supportive presence at company events. As she approached Daniel's corner office, however, she noticed the door was ajar and heard hushed voices. Carefully, she peered through the crack. What she saw made her stomach drop. Inside, Daniel stood inches away from Julia Monroe, their heads bent close in an intimate exchange. Julia's hand lightly grazed Daniel's arm, a gesture too familiar to be merely professional. The way Daniel looked at Julia, eyes soft with affection, was a look Rachel had once thought was reserved only for her. Rachel froze, heart pounding. She watched as Daniel reached out and gently tucked a strand of Julia's auburn hair behind her ear. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. The Mediterranean wraps slipped from her hands, landing on the polished floor with a dull thud. Startled, Daniel and Julia jerked apart. Julia's eyes darted to the doorway, meeting Rachel's shocked gaze. Daniel's face went white, panic flashing across his features. Rachel stepped back, trying to steady herself. She could hear a faint ringing in her ears, and was unsure if it was from her own shock or the baby's swift kicks inside her. She turned and stumbled down the corridor, tears burning her eyes. Daniel scrambled to follow, calling after her, but she was already in the elevator, the doors sliding shut before he could reach her. By the time Daniel got to the lobby, Rachel was gone. Frantically, he tried calling her, but her phone went to voicemail. Fear and guilt raged inside him. Julia, who had followed him downstairs, placed a tentative hand on his shoulder. "Daniel," she began, her voice wavering, "we need to talk about this. We need a plan." He shrugged off her hand, eyes still fixed on the revolving door through which Rachel had disappeared. I have to find her," he muttered, pushing past Julia. Daniel sped home, heart hammering in his chest. He found the house silent, lights off, as though no one had been there for hours. A sense of dread crawled up his spine. Rachel's car was missing from the driveway, and so were several of her belongings, her purse, coat, and the ultrasound pictures she usually kept on the coffee table. A call to Rachel's closest friend, Lily Chambers, yielded no real answers. Lily claimed she hadn't heard from Rachel, but her voice quivered with suspicion as Daniel explained the situation. Desperate, Daniel dialed Martin and Sandra Harrington, his parents. They hadn't heard from her either. He spent the next hour pacing the living room, calling Rachel repeatedly, leaving tearful voicemails. With every passing minute, he felt his world collapsing. The guilt that had been hovering over him for months finally descended with full force. He felt reckless and selfish, realizing belatedly the depth of the pain he'd inflicted on the woman he had once sworn to cherish. Then came a text message from an unknown number. Daniel's heart leapt, hoping it might be Rachel. Instead, it read, "Daniel, this is Mark Donovan. Rachel's OB-GYN. She's here. She's all right physically, but her blood pressure is alarmingly high. She needs rest and minimal stress. She doesn't want to see you right now, but I thought you should know." Daniel sank onto the sofa, trembling. He had never felt so powerless. His pregnant wife was in distress, and the reason for it was brutally clear. Him. The enormity of his betrayal weighed on him like a slab of concrete. He pictured Rachel alone in a doctor's office, tears staining her cheeks, and it made him feel a sharp stab of regret, so intense it bordered on physical pain. Night fell without any word from Rachel. Daniel was left to replay the day's events in his mind, consumed by dread. He knew that facing Rachel would be inevitable, but he also knew he had crossed a line from which there might be no return. For the first time in his life, Daniel Harrington, the man who had always been in control, felt utterly, irreparably lost. 2 days passed without any communication from Rachel. Daniel tried every method he could think of. Texts, calls, emails, flowers delivered to Lily Chambers' home, anything to reach her. Each attempt was met with silence or outright rejection. Julia, too, was in a state of anxiety. Though she bore her guilt in her own way, she was simultaneously aware that her position in Daniel's life had dramatically shifted. On the third day, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Rachel, "We need to talk. I'll come by the house at 4 p.m. Please make sure she's not there." It was a surreal moment for Daniel. He had dreaded this confrontation, but also yearned for it. He needed to see Rachel, to try to explain. With shaking hands, he typed out a reply confirming he'd be alone. Then he told Julia to stay away, which she reluctantly agreed to do, though not without a hint of resentment. At precisely 4 p.m., Rachel entered the house. She looked pale, her eyes puffy from crying. She wore a loose sweater that draped over her growing belly, a reminder of the life developing inside her. Daniel took a few uncertain steps toward her, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm not here for a hug or a kiss. I'm here to figure out our next steps." Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes roaming over Rachel's face, searching for a glimmer of the warmth that once defined their marriage. "Rachel, I'm so sorry," he began, voice cracking with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you. I got lost." Her lower lip quivered, but she steadied herself, drawing in a shaky breath. "You got lost? Is that what you call it? Sneaking around with another woman while I'm pregnant with our child? I know it sounds terrible." "It is terrible, Daniel." Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this. Do you have any idea what stress like this can do to me or to the baby?" Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, feeling tears burn behind his lids. "I never wanted to put you in harm's way. I was confused. Things felt stagnant, and I chased something I thought I was missing. But I see now I've jeopardized everything. Please, Just let me fix this. Rachel let out a harsh laugh that sounded nothing like her usual self. Fix this? How do you propose to fix breaking your wedding vows? Do you even love her? He hesitated. The question pierced him more than he'd anticipated. I don't know. I care about her, but it's complicated. I love you, Rachel. You're my wife, the mother of my child. Tears glistened in Rachel's eyes, but she kept her gaze steely. I need time, Daniel. I need to think about what's best for me and this baby. But you should know I'm considering a divorce. Her words landed like a sledgehammer. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but she held up her hand again. I haven't decided yet, but you should prepare yourself for that possibility. If I stay, there will be conditions. Counseling, a formal end to your relationship with Julia, and an effort from you to regain my trust. He nodded slowly, afraid to say more, worried that any wrong word might push her further away. After a tense pause, Rachel continued, We're already meeting with an attorney. In 2 days, you, me, and my lawyer. We'll figure out custody arrangements, finances, everything. I can't believe this is where our marriage is headed, but you left me no choice. Daniel's chest tightened at the finality in her tone. If that's what you want, he managed to say, voice barely above a whisper, I'll do whatever it takes. Rachel turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. She glanced around the living room, her eyes lingering on the baby's half-assembled crib. I did love you, Daniel, she said quietly, with all my heart. And then she was gone. The echo of the closing door, a painful reminder that the life they once shared was now in tatters. Daniel stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of his choices bearing down on him. He thought of the vow he'd made to Rachel on their wedding day to love and cherish her in good times, and in bad, and realized he had broken it in the most profound way. He also knew he stood at a crossroads. He could fight to mend his marriage, or he could let it dissolve and pursue a future with Julia. Either way, he was about to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. Rachel's ultimatum lingered in Daniel's thoughts, tormenting him with its stark simplicity. If he wanted to save his marriage, Julia Monroe had to be out of the picture. And yet, the thought of severing ties with Julia felt almost impossible. Since their affair began, she had become more than a mere escape. She was a companion who ignited his ambition and matched his passion. Days turned into a blur of tense negotiations. Rachel retained a top-notch divorce attorney who specialized in high-profile separations. Meanwhile, Daniel scrambled to secure legal representation of his own, if only to keep some semblance of control over his assets. At the office, rumor mills churned furiously. Fiona McNeil, his assistant, did her best to shield Daniel from gossip, but Harrington Innovations was abuzz with whispers about the CEO's messy personal life. Julia grew restless. The affair had been thrilling when it was hidden in the shadows, but now the shadows were disappearing. She would sit in Daniel's office, arms crossed, demanding clarity. What happens now, Daniel? Are you going to leave Rachel for me? Or will you cut me off to keep your marriage intact? Daniel would stumble over his words. It's not that simple, Julia. Rachel's pregnant, my child is involved. I can't just walk away from that. Then what does that mean for us? Julia would ask, her eyes searching his face for answers he didn't have. Are we just done? After all we've shared? He could never give her a straight response, which only fueled her anxiety. At times, Julia threatened to end it herself. Other times, she'd confide in him about her own fear of losing him forever. The tension was palpable, like a taut wire that threatened to snap at any moment. When Daniel and Rachel finally sat down with their attorneys, the meeting was as icy as it was disheartening. Rachel's lawyer presented a settlement that allowed Rachel primary custody of the unborn child, with generous child support and a sizable chunk of Daniel's assets should she decide to finalize the divorce. Rachel, for her part, sat stony-faced, avoiding Daniel's eyes. Daniel's lawyer tried to negotiate better terms, but Daniel found himself strangely resigned. He couldn't imagine fighting Rachel, especially not now, with her health and the baby at stake. The last thing he wanted was an ugly legal battle splashed across tabloids. Yet, despite everything, Rachel stopped short of filing the divorce papers. "I just need time, Daniel," she repeated whenever he asked. "I'm not ready to make a final decision. But you need to realize that any hope for us depends on you ending things with Julia for good." Caught between the two women, Daniel sank into a kind of paralysis. Each night, he'd return to the lavish, now empty house, the walls echoing with memories of a happier past. Eventually, he started crashing on a friend's couch or booking a suite at a hotel rather than face the loneliness of that big house. Meanwhile, Harrington Innovations began to show cracks. Investors were skittish about Daniel's reliability, some worried that personal scandal might overshadow the company's mission. Michael Parker, Daniel's mentor, tried to rally support, but he, too, started pressing Daniel for clarity. "Son, you need to get your house in order," Michael warned during a tense lunch. "People are losing faith in your ability to lead." In the midst of this chaos, Daniel found it increasingly difficult to focus on the demands of his company. His once razor-sharp instincts dulled under the weight of personal turmoil. Late one night, he sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights, wondering where the unstoppable Daniel Harrington had gone. That same night, he texted Julia to meet him at their usual spot, a quaint bistro that stayed open late. She arrived with a guarded expression. Over coffee, Daniel laid his cards on the table. "I can't keep living like this. Rachel hasn't filed for divorce yet, but she might as well have. I'm losing my grip on everything, my marriage, my business, my sanity." Julia studied him, eyes filled with a complicated mix of empathy and frustration. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm considering leaving Rachel," Daniel admitted, his voice shaking. "I don't want to keep hurting her, and I don't see how we recover from this. But I need to know if there's a real future with you, or if we're just living in a fantasy." Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment Daniel thought he saw a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "Daniel, I do want a future with you, but are you sure? Once you leave Rachel, there's no going back." He took a deep breath, feeling an ache in his chest as he uttered the words. "I'm sure. I can't pretend anymore. Rachel deserves someone who won't betray her, and I can't let you go, Julia." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, and just like that, the line was drawn. Daniel walked away from that bistro, believing he'd made the hardest decision of his life, fully unaware that the real consequences were yet to come. With his decision made, the dominoes began to fall swiftly. Rachel, shattered by Daniel's choice, quietly moved out of the Highland Park estate, finding refuge in a smaller, more modest home in the suburbs, closer to her best friend, Lily Chambers. She made no dramatic scene, just a calm yet heartbreaking acceptance that Daniel was no longer hers. Despite her pain, Rachel was determined to maintain her composure for the sake of her unborn child. Though they spoke rarely, she insisted that Daniel attend important doctor's appointments, believing their child deserved both parents involved. These appointments were tense and awkward. Rachel spoke to Daniel only to exchange vital information, never meeting his gaze. In the meantime, Daniel's relationship with Julia moved at breakneck speed. Freed from secrecy, they went public as a couple, attending events and dinners where they were often the talk of the room. Some acquaintances rolled their eyes, labeling Julia the homewrecker, while others saw Daniel as a cautionary tale of midlife crisis. But Julia was steadfast. In private, she encouraged Daniel's grand visions for his company, praising his every success. With her marketing acumen, she attempted to salvage what she could of Daniel's reputation, aligning him with philanthropic endeavors and carefully orchestrating public statements. When Daniel's divorce from Rachel officially went through just 2 months before Rachel's due date, he felt both a sense of loss and an odd form of liberation. Rachel received a substantial settlement, one Daniel did not contest. He had insisted she take whatever she needed for the baby's future, a small but significant gesture that echoed his lingering guilt. Buoyed by Julia's unwavering presence, Daniel impulsively proposed to her. The question came one night over champagne on the balcony of Julia's high-rise apartment, with the lights of Dallas sparkling below them. Julia accepted with tears in her eyes, whispering, "I love you, Daniel. I've loved you since the moment we met." Their wedding took place just weeks later, a small private ceremony in a stylish rooftop venue. Despite the short notice, Julia wore a designer gown that clung elegantly to her figure, and Daniel donned a sleek, custom-tailored suit. Close friends attended, but notably absent were Daniel's parents Martin and Sandra Harrington, who disapproved of his choices. Rachel, of course, was not there, having received a polite but meaningless invitation. She was in the final weeks of pregnancy, far too emotionally frayed to even consider witnessing the spectacle. The ceremony felt surreal to Daniel, as if he were watching a movie about someone else's life. There were moments when he glanced at Julia and saw only the future, a promising, exciting unknown. But there were also flickers of doubt, like a faint static on an otherwise clear signal. During the vows, he caught himself choking up, recalling the promises he'd once made to Rachel. He pushed the thought away and focused on Julia's bright smile, telling himself that this time it would be different. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Julia kissed him passionately, unafraid of the small crowd bearing witness. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment that would later find its way into the society pages. Tech mogul Daniel Harrington Marries Mistress, in exclusive Dallas affair, read one particularly sensational headline. The reception was intimate, just a few hours of champagne toasts and gourmet canapés. Julia's closest friends cheered her on, while Daniel's colleagues made polite conversation, uncertain how to address the elephant in the room. Michael Parker attended out of loyalty to Daniel, but he offered only a curt handshake and forced congratulations. After the festivities, Daniel and Julia retreated to a lavish honeymoon suite in a luxury hotel. As Julia slipped out of her gown and into bed, Daniel stared out at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He wanted to believe that he had made the right choice, that this was the fresh start he'd been craving. Julia's arms wrapped around him from behind, and he allowed himself to savor the warmth of her embrace, momentarily pushing aside the haunting thought, at what cost had he found this new beginning? The first few weeks of Daniel's new marriage were a whirlwind of media attention and social chatter. Julia insisted on controlling the narrative, orchestrating photo ops that depicted their blissful union. Magazine profiles portrayed them as a modern power couple, though the comment sections often told a different story, filled with scorn and judgment. Still, Daniel tried to focus on the positives. He was determined to prove to himself and to the world that his decision to leave Rachel was not a mistake. He poured himself into Harrington Innovations, working late into the night to finalize a major product launch. Julia assisted by leveraging her marketing connections, lining up interviews, and polishing Daniel's public persona. Yet for all their efforts, things began to slip. Investors remained wary, shaken by the instability in Daniel's personal life. A few key partners withdrew funding, citing irreconcilable differences in vision. Privately, Daniel suspected it was about trust. His affair had undermined his credibility, and they worried if he'd be as cavalier with business commitments as he had been with his marriage vows. In the midst of this, Rachel gave birth to a baby boy, whom she named Gabriel Martin Harrington, taking Daniel's middle name and her father-in-law's name as a nod to family ties. Daniel found out through a quick text message from Rachel, "Gabriel is here. Healthy. I'll allow visits if you want, but only scheduled times." The text shattered him more than he expected. He longed to be present at Gabriel's birth, to hold his son in his arms. But Rachel had made it clear there was no place for him in the delivery room. He didn't blame her. He had chosen to be elsewhere, chasing a new life that had no room for the old. In the weeks that followed, Daniel tried to juggle fatherhood visits with baby Gabriel and his new life with Julia. It was an uneasy balance. Rachel's terms were strict. Daniel could visit once a week under her supervision. The first time he laid eyes on his son, he felt an overwhelming surge of love and regret. Gabriel was tiny and vulnerable, with soft black hair and the same dark eyes Daniel saw in the mirror every morning. As he cradled the baby, tears slipped down his cheeks, tears of awe, guilt, and longing. Back at home, Julia feigned support, but she bristled whenever Daniel left to see Gabriel. "Every time you see Rachel, you come back changed," she observed one evening. "It's like your mind is somewhere else." "Gabriel is my son," Daniel replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "Of course it affects me. I wish you could understand." Julia didn't respond, but her expression spoke volumes. She wanted him all to herself, unburdened by the spectre of his past life. Slowly, the emotional wedge between them grew. Meanwhile, Harrington Innovations slid further into crisis. The product launch date loomed, and Daniel was burning through savings to keep the company afloat. Some staff members, unsettled by the instability, resigned for more secure positions elsewhere. Rumors swirled that Daniel was losing his grip on the firm he had built from the ground up. One pivotal night, Daniel met with Anthony Green, an old friend and fellow entrepreneur who delivered a sobering message over drinks at a downtown bar. "You've got a major cash flow problem, Daniel. If you don't get new investors soon, you'll be forced to either downsize drastically or sell off parts of the company." Daniel stared into his glass of whiskey, the ice melting into a watery swirl. "I can't believe it's come to this. Just a year ago, Harrington Innovations was on the cusp of becoming a tech giant." Anthony shrugged sympathetically. "A lot's happened in that year. You still have time to turn it around, but you need to focus. Stop chasing magazine covers and start running your business." Daniel couldn't deny the truth in Anthony's words. He returned home that night, exhausted, to find Julia in the living room, sipping wine while flipping through an upscale interior design catalogue. When he tried to talk to her about the financial crisis, she brushed it off. "We'll figure something out," she said dismissively. "You always do, Daniel." But the confidence she once radiated now felt like hollow words. Gone was the unquenchable fire that had drawn him to her in the first place. He saw in her eyes that her interest waned when the glitz and glamour began to fade. Their relationship, once fueled by passion and novelty, now showed the wear and tear of everyday responsibilities, and it was far less enchanting without the sheen of secrecy. As the days wore on, Daniel found himself yearning for the simpler times he had once deemed too predictable. He missed waking up beside Rachel, discussing their child's future without anger or tears. He missed the steady affection that had been there all along, hidden behind the routines he'd foolishly labeled as mundane. Most of all, he missed being a man who still had a semblance of integrity, who didn't feel like his entire world was crumbling beneath him. He had left a pregnant wife to marry his mistress, and now the consequences were mounting in ways he never could have imagined. A restless, gnawing anxiety took hold of him at all hours of the day and night. Daniel Harrington, once the golden boy of Dallas tech, was on the brink of losing everything. The day of the ill-fated product launch arrived with a pall cast over Harrington Innovations. The hype Daniel had once counted on was overshadowed by investor skepticism and public scrutiny. Despite Julia's best efforts to spin a positive narrative in the press, the software rolled out to a lukewarm response. Bug reports and negative reviews piled up in the first 48 hours, sending the company's stock plummeting. Within a week, Daniel found himself in emergency meetings, trying to salvage what remained of his reputation and his business. A major investor pulled out at the last minute, citing a lack of confidence in leadership. Panic set in among the management team. Normally poised executives were resigning left and right. Late one night, Daniel remained at the office alone, hunkered down in the conference room with spreadsheets, projections, and frantic emails. Sleep-deprived and emotionally drained, he looked out at the Dallas skyline and couldn't help but wonder what might have been had. He not let his personal life implode so spectacularly. Julia, for her part, found the mounting tension unbearable. Rather than supporting Daniel in the crisis, she grew increasingly distant and irritable. She complained about his long hours, his lack of attention, and the financial strain threatening their lavish lifestyle. One evening, as Daniel stumbled through the front door with dark circles under his eyes, Julia confronted him with an ultimatum of her own. "I can't live like this, Daniel," she said, arms folded across her chest. "Every day it's a new crisis at the office. You're never here, and when you are, you're too exhausted to even talk to me. This isn't the life I signed up for." Daniel dropped his briefcase on the floor, rubbing his temples. "I'm sorry, Julia. I'm trying, but we're hemorrhaging money. If we don't secure funding soon, we might have to shut down entire divisions." She pursed her lips. "So what? You want me to just sit here and watch everything crumble? I left a successful career in LA to be with you, and now all I get is stress and bad PR." Anger flared inside Daniel. "What did you expect? You fell in love with the risk-taker, the entrepreneur. This is part of the package. It's not always private jets and champagne." Julia scoffed, turning away. "Maybe if you had kept your personal life in check, your business wouldn't be tanking. People don't trust you anymore, Daniel." Her words stung with a cruel truth. Daniel seethed with a mix of guilt and resentment. "I'm not the only one who made a choice here, Julia. You knew I was married. We both crossed that line." She glared at him, tears forming in her eyes. "You said you'd never bring that up. You promised we were building a future together." Daniel shook his head, his voice cracking. "At what cost? Look around us. This is the future we built." Julia's anger gave way to hurt, and she brushed past him into the bedroom, slamming the door. Daniel sank onto the living room sofa, burying his face in his hands. He felt trapped in a nightmare of his own making, longing for an escape, but seeing no clear path forward. The next day, while Daniel was in the midst of a critical investor presentation, his phone vibrated incessantly. Initially, he ignored it, but something compelled him to glance at the screen. It was a message from Lily Chambers. "Rachel collapsed. She's in the hospital. Thought you should know." His heart pounded. Without excuse or explanation, he left the meeting and rushed to the hospital. Upon arrival, he found Lily pacing the corridor, tears in her eyes. "She's exhausted, overworked, and stressed," Lily explained. "She fainted while feeding Gabriel, but she'll be okay." Daniel breathed a short-lived sigh of relief. Guilt overwhelmed him at the thought that he wasn't there when Rachel needed him. Slowly he approached Rachel's room, his steps hesitant. Inside, Rachel lay in a hospital bed, dark circles under her eyes, her face pale. Gabriel slept in a small bassinet nearby. Daniel stepped in quietly, his gaze meeting Rachel's. For the first time in months, he saw a flicker of something other than anger in her eyes. Maybe it was weariness, maybe it was acceptance. He gently picked up Gabriel, holding the baby close. Tears welled in his eyes as he rocked his son, realizing how much he had missed. Rachel spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's a good baby, Daniel. Sleeps through most nights. But it's hard doing this alone." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. I never meant for you to do it alone, I'm sorry. She closed her eyes briefly, struggling to keep her composure. I know, she finally said, a single tear slipping down her cheek. But sorry doesn't undo everything. In that moment, Daniel felt an overwhelming urge to put everything right, to regain the life he had so recklessly thrown away. But he looked at Rachel's exhausted face and knew that his apology might be too little, too late. He also knew that Julia was waiting at home, likely growing more resentful by the hour. Outside in the hallway, Lily caught Daniel's arm. I hope you realize now that your choices have consequences, Daniel. Rachel might never be the same, and Gabriel deserves better. His jaw clenched. I know. I'm trying to figure out how to fix this. Lily's eyes narrowed. You can start by being there for them in some way that doesn't tear everyone apart even further. Daniel nodded. But the path to that kind of redemption seemed distant and steep. In the quiet hush of the hospital corridor, he realized that the reckoning was far from over. The hardest part was still to come. The next few weeks passed in a haze of difficult decisions and painful realizations. Rachel was discharged from the hospital with strict orders to rest, so Lily moved in temporarily to help care for Gabriel. Daniel tried to visit often, awkwardly offering to take over feeding and diaper duties whenever Rachel would allow it. She remained guarded, but her anger had softened into a quiet sadness. At Harrington Innovations, the writing was on the wall. Despite Daniel's best efforts and last-minute pitches to potential partners, the company couldn't secure the funds it needed. He began the difficult process of laying off half the staff. Loyal employees wept as they boxed up their belongings, some throwing him resentful glares. The once bustling office space now echoed with empty cubicles and half-dismantled equipment. Julia observed these changes with increasing distress. The glamorous lifestyle she had envisioned was slipping away. Tension in their home soared, culminating one night in a heated argument that ended with Julia throwing a glass against the wall in frustration. "Why should I stay with you while everything collapses?" she cried, eyes brimming with tears. "I gave up my life in LA for this." Daniel, trying to remain calm, responded, "I'm sorry it's not living up to your expectations. But this is reality, the ups and downs of building a company. Right now, we're in a down." She threw her hands up. "It's not just the company, Daniel. It's us. You're always running off to see Rachel and the baby. You're constantly depressed about work. This is a far cry from the Daniel I fell in love with." He flinched at the accusation. "Or maybe this is just the Daniel you never really knew. Maybe you like the idea of me more than the reality." Julia stood there, stunned into silence. Slowly, she reached for her purse and jacket. "I'm staying at a hotel tonight. I need space." As she left, Daniel sank onto the sofa, exhaling a shuddering breath. The dream he had chased was unraveling, revealing itself as a mirage. The exhilaration of secret rendezvous had morphed into the cold truth of daily life, with someone he barely understood. Over the next few days, Daniel came to a sobering conclusion. His marriage to Julia was built on shaky ground. What started as lust and excitement had withered under the glare of real-world problems. Meanwhile, the child he had with Rachel, his son Gabriel, was the one bright spot in an otherwise dismal landscape. Finally, one afternoon, Daniel mustered the courage to have a frank conversation with Julia. She had come home briefly to collect some personal items while giving him a frosty reception. Standing in the living room, where once they had cuddled on the couch, he spoke quietly. "I think we made a mistake," he said, voice trembling slightly. "Our relationship was born out of secrecy and infatuation, and we never built a proper foundation. I care about you, but this isn't working." Julia's eyes filled with tears, though a part of her seemed resigned to this outcome. "So you want a divorce?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes. I need to focus on my son, on rebuilding some semblance of a real life. I don't blame you entirely. I played my part in all this, but if we stay married, we'll both just end up miserable." She let out a shaky exhale. "I loved you, Daniel, or at least I thought I did, but maybe we never really knew each other." They shared a sad, understanding look. In the end, there was no explosive fight, just a mutual, grief-laden acceptance that their marriage was ending almost as abruptly as it began. In the days that followed, Julia moved out, and Daniel began the legal steps to dissolve his second marriage. Paparazzi hounded him, reveling in the downfall of the once celebrated tech mogul. Harrington Innovations continued its downward spiral, forcing Daniel to seek a buyout from a larger competitor. The deal offered him a fraction of what the company was once worth, but it was better than letting it sink entirely. News of the buyout broke on local financial segments, labeling it a fire sale. Daniel watched the coverage in silence, accepting that this was the consequence of his choices. But as he stood on the sidewalk outside the office building he had once owned, he felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. He had lost so much, but he finally saw a chance to start anew. That evening, Daniel drove to the modest suburban home where Rachel lived with Gabriel. Heart pounding, he knocked on the door. Rachel opened it, holding Gabriel in her arms. "Daniel," she acknowledged, stepping aside to let him in. They sat down in the living room, Gabriel cooing softly. The baby's innocent gaze was a stark reminder of life's bigger picture. In that moment, Daniel realized he wanted to be a good father more than anything else. "I finalized the sale of Harrington Innovations today," he said, his voice subdued. "I lost the company." Rachel studied him quietly. "I heard. I'm sorry." He nodded, eyes drifting to Gabriel. "I made a lot of mistakes, Rachel. I hurt you. I betrayed our family. And I don't expect forgiveness overnight. But I'm here now. I'll do whatever it takes to be in Gabriel's life, to support him, to be a father he can be proud of." She regarded him for a long moment. Then, with a gentleness that broke his heart, she replied, "We'll see. I won't shut you out, Daniel, but we have a long way to go. Gabriel deserves the best from both of us." He bowed his head. "That's all I'm asking, for a chance to do right by him, and maybe, in time, to show you that I'm not that man anymore." Rachel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We'll take it one day at a time," she whispered. In that quiet moment, Daniel felt the first faint stirrings of hope. He had lost nearly everything: his company, his reputation, his marriage to Rachel, and then his hasty union with Julia. But Gabriel was here, a living testament to the future, and there was a possibility, however slim, that Daniel could reclaim some measure of dignity. In the end, the grand lesson was painfully simple. Chasing illusions of excitement and novelty had cost him the stability and love he'd always taken for granted. Now, stripped of wealth and illusions, he stood humbled, ready to rebuild his life from the ashes. Though uncertain and fraught with regret, he finally understood that true fortune wasn't counted in dollar signs or fleeting passions, but in the bonds that survived life's deepest betrayals. Every choice we make carries consequences, often far more profound than we can predict. Daniel Harrington learned this the hard way. In a whirlwind of passion, he surrendered a loving marriage and a thriving empire, only to be left with a broken heart, shattered business, and a lifetime's worth of regret. Yet even in the wreckage, a glimmer of redemption emerged in the form of his newborn son, Gabriel. Daniel discovered that genuine relationships and the willingness to accept responsibility outshine any lavish fantasy. If you found yourself gripped by this tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and the struggle for redemption, show your support by liking this video, sharing it with friends, and subscribing to our channel. Don't miss upcoming stories that explore the triumphs and tragedies of complex human lives. Press that subscribe button and stay tuned for more dramatic tales that remind us how fragile our choices can be.